The thermometer read -32, but the howling wind chill made it a deadly -60. The farmhouse walls were groaning, frost creeping up the inside of the living room windows like a white disease. If they stayed in the house, they were going to freeze to death before morning. Oliver Stanton stood by the frosted glass of the kitchen window, scraping a tiny circle through the ice with his thumbnail. Outside there was no horizon, no tree line, no driveway. There was only a violent, chaotic wall of blinding white. It was the second week of January, and the Bitterroot Valley had been swallowed whole by a freak meteorological phenomenon. The local news station had called it a bond cyclone before the power grid completely failed, but the term felt horribly inadequate. This wasn't just a storm, it was an atmospheric assault. Oliver and his wife Rebecca had moved their family from the mild suburbs of Oregon to this secluded 80-acre property in Montana just 6 months prior. They had purchased the property from the estate of a man named Greg Farnsworth, a retired welder who had let the 1920s farmhouse fall into deep disrepair. Oliver, an architectural drafter by trade, had grand visions of renovating the property. But visions didn't patch drafty walls, and they certainly didn't insulate a century-old foundation. Behind Oliver, the silence of the dead house was deafening, broken only by the aggressive rattling of the window panes. Oliver. Rebecca's voice trembled. She was huddled on the living room rug beneath 3 layers of heavy down comforters tucked securely against her sides with their children, 8-year-old Noah and 5-year-old Mia. "Still blowing," Oliver said, keeping his voice carefully level. He walked over to the stone fireplace. The fire he had built hours ago was dying, struggling to draw oxygen due to the intense downdraft forcing bitter air back down the chimney. Smoke was intermittently puffing into the room, stinging their eyes. The catastrophic failure had happened fast. At 2 p.m., the wind had snapped an ancient, rotting oak tree near the property line. The massive trunk had crashed directly onto the above-ground propane lines that fed the home's primary furnace, severing the valve entirely. By 3:15 p.m., the regional power grid collapsed under the weight of an inch of solid ice, followed by heavy, wet snow. By 6 p.m., the ambient temperature inside the farmhouse had plummeted from a comfortable 68 degrees to an agonizing 39. Now, at 9 p.m., it was 22 degrees inside the living room. The house was dying, and it was taking them down with it. "Noah is shivering in his sleep," Rebecca whispered, her lips tinted a terrifying shade of pale blue. "His asthma. The cold air is going to trigger it." "Where is Carter?" He said he was bringing the snowcat. Carter Evans, their nearest neighbor 3 miles down the county road, had managed to get a brief satellite phone call through just as the grid failed. He had promised to fire up his heavy-duty snowcat and retrieve them. But that was 7 hours ago. In these conditions, 80-mile-per-hour gusts and zero visibility, Carter wasn't coming. Nobody was coming. Oliver walked over and knelt beside his family. He placed a hand on Noah's forehead. It was cold to the touch. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in the back of Oliver's throat. The old farmhouse was basically a wooden tent. The insulation in the attic was degraded, and the original single-pane windows were hemorrhaging what little heat their bodies produced. "We can't stay in this room," Oliver said, the reality solidifying in his mind. "We're losing heat faster than the fire can make it. And if I build the fire any larger, the downdraft is going to fill the room with carbon monoxide." "Where else do we go?" Rebecca asked, tears welling in her eyes only to freeze on her eyelashes. "The basement is flooded and frozen. The bedrooms are worse." Oliver stood up, his mind racing through the property's layout. A survival principle he'd read years ago surfaced in his memory. To survive extreme cold, you don't heat the environment, you heat the microenvironment. You shrink your footprint. A 2,500-square-foot drafty farmhouse was impossible to heat. They needed a space no larger than a tent, but insulated enough to trap human body heat. His eyes drifted toward the back door, looking out toward the massive shadow looming 50 yards across the frozen yard. "The old livestock barn, the barn," Oliver muttered. "Are you out of your mind?" Rebecca snapped, fear escalating her tone. "It's practically outdoors in there. The siding is rotted." The barn is an envelope, Oliver explained, speaking quickly, his brain finally latching onto a desperate, crazy blueprint. It blocks the wind, it keeps the snow off. But you're right, it's too big to heat. But remember what Farnsworth left in the back stalls? Rebecca stared at him, her brow furrowed. The metal plates, corrugated steel panels, Oliver said, his heart hammering against his ribs. Curved structural panels for a Quonset hut. Farnsworth was going to build a detached garage before he passed away. The arches are just sitting stacked in the dry dirt in the back of the barn, along with a mountain of old, dry hay bales. Oliver, you can't build a metal building in the middle of a blizzard. I'm not building a building. I'm building a bunker. Inside the barn, Oliver said, grabbing his heavy insulated Carhartt jacket. A shelter within a shelter. The barn takes the brunt of the 80-mile-per-hour wind. Inside the barn, the air is still. If I can bolt enough of those curved Quonset panels together to make a small tunnel and bury the outside of it in hay bales for insulation, it will trap all our body heat. Plus, I can safely run the small portable propane camping heater inside it without the wind blowing it out. Rebecca looked down at Noah, whose chest was beginning to hitch with the early warning signs of an asthma attack brought on by the freezing air. She looked back at Oliver, her expression hardening from terror into sheer maternal resolve. "How long will it take to build?" she asked. "If you help me, 2 hours," Oliver said. "But we have to move now, before our core temperatures drop any lower and we lose dexterity." The 50-yard trek from the back door of the farmhouse to the barn was the longest journey of Oliver's life. They prepared like astronauts stepping onto a hostile alien planet. They wrapped Noah and Mia in heavy wool blankets, securing them with duct tape so the wind couldn't rip the fabric away. Oliver tied a nylon climbing rope around his waist, looping the center around Rebecca and tying the tail end to the heavy iron radiator by the mudroom door. If they lost their bearings in the whiteout, the rope was their only way back. Opening the back door was like opening an airlock into a jet engine. The wind screamed with a physical force that immediately threw Oliver backward. Ice crystals, sharp as shattered glass, sandblasted any exposed skin. He grabbed the door frame, lowered his center of gravity, and pushed out into the void. Rebecca followed, carrying Mia tightly against her chest, while Oliver carried Noah. The snow was thigh-deep, but the drifts in the yard had piled up to Oliver's waist. He bulldozed through it, his boots finding no purchase on the solid ice beneath. The cold was so absolute that it instantly robbed the air from his lungs. It felt like breathing in razor blades. Just 10 more yards. 5 more yards. Oliver slammed shoulder first into the heavy sliding wooden door of the barn. It was frozen shut, panic flared. He handed Noah to Rebecca, who was already shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear it over the wind. Grabbing a heavy iron crowbar he kept stashed under the porch, Oliver wedged it beneath the sliding track and threw his entire body weight onto the bar. With a deafening crack, the ice shattered. The heavy door rolled back just enough to let them squeeze inside. They tumbled into the darkness, shoving the door closed behind them. The immediate absence of the wind was a profound relief. The barn was freezing easily 20 below zero, but the air was entirely still. The towering timber roof groaned ominously overhead, the massive rafters cracking under the immense weight of the snow and ice accumulating on the shingles. "Stay here," Oliver panted, clicking on his heavy-duty maglite. The beam cut through the dusty, frigid air, illuminating the cavernous 4,000-square-foot interior. He ran to the back stalls. There, exactly as he remembered, were stacks of deep corrugated galvanized steel arches. They were heavy, cumbersome pieces of metal, designed to overlap and bolt together to form a freestanding, semicircular Quonset hut. Farnsworth had left boxes of heavy-duty nuts and bolts sitting right next to them. "Rebecca," Oliver yelled, his breath pluming in the flashlight beam. "I need you." He set up 2 battery-powered LED work lights, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the dirt floor. Time was their biggest enemy. The human body burns massive amounts of calories simply trying to stay warm. Soon, their energy reserves would crash, leading to hypothermia and lethargy. "We only need 3 arches," Oliver instructed. his fingers already going numb as he stripped off his thick outer gloves to handle the bolts. "That will give us a tunnel about 10 feet long and 8 feet wide. Just big enough to lie down in." The physical labor was excruciating. Each steel arch weighed nearly 80 pounds. Dragging them into the center of the barn, Oliver's muscles screamed in protest. The metal was so cold it felt like it was burning his bare fingertips. He positioned the first arch, holding it upright. "Hold it steady," he told Rebecca. She braced her weight against the freezing steel. Oliver grabbed a second panel, overlapping the flanged edges. "Bolts!" he barked. With shaking, clumsy fingers, they began threading the thick steel bolts through the pre-drilled holes, twisting on the nuts. They didn't have time to wrench them down perfectly tight. They just needed structural integrity. The Quonset design was brilliant in its simplicity. The arch was self-supporting. Once the first 2 panels were bolted together, they stood on their own. As they dragged the third panel into place, a loud, explosive crack echoed through the massive barn. Rebecca screamed, ducking instinctively. Oliver shined the flashlight toward the roof. One of the secondary crossbeams, 30 feet above them, had splintered under the snow load. Dust and ancient hay rained down on them. "The roof is failing," Rebecca gasped, staring upward in horror. "It'll hold," Oliver lied, desperately trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "We just have to finish. Keep bolting." Within 45 minutes, they had a 10-foot steel tunnel sitting in the middle of the dirt floor. But a bare metal tunnel would just act as a refrigerator. They needed insulation. "The hay!" Oliver yelled, pointing to the massive stacks of old, dry alfalfa bales lining the western wall. "We build a wall around the steel." This was the stroke of survival genius. Working together in a frantic rhythm, they began dragging the heavy 60-pound rectangular bales, stacking them like giant bricks against the outside of the curved steel Quonset. They built the hay wall 3 bales thick on the sides and managed to toss a double layer over the top of the curved roof. They stacked bales to close off the back end of the tunnel entirely, and built a staggered entryway at the front to block drafts. They had effectively created a heavily insulated cocoon. Oliver rushed to the front corner of the barn, where he stored his camping gear. He grabbed 2 heavy canvas tarps, a thick foam sleeping pad, their 4-person winter camping tent, and a small catalytic propane heater rated for indoor use. He dragged the supplies into the dark, hay-smelling tunnel of the Quonset. He laid the tarps down over the freezing dirt, followed by the foam pad. Then, he pitched the nylon camping tent inside the metal tunnel. It was a Russian doll of survival. The barn blocked the weather. The hay-insulated Quonset hut blocked the ambient cold. The tent trapped their body heat. "Bring them in!" Oliver shouted. Rebecca hurried into the tunnel, ushering Noah and Mia into the small nylon tent. Oliver followed, zipping the tent flaps tightly shut behind them. He set the small catalytic propane heater on a fireproof metal tray near the door and clicked the ignition. A soft blue glow illuminated the small space. For the first 5 minutes, nothing happened. They lay huddled together, trembling violently, listening to the muffled, distant roar of the 80-mile-per-hour winds tearing at the barn outside. Then, slowly, miraculously, the physics of their desperate shelter began to work. The heat from the small propane heater, combined with the body heat of 4 terrified people, had nowhere to go. It hit the nylon tent, bounced into the steel Quonset walls, and was trapped by 3 feet of solid hay insulation. Within 20 minutes, the temperature inside the small tent rose from a lethal 20 degrees to a stable, life-saving 55 degrees. Noah's breathing began to steady. The blue tint slowly faded from Rebecca's lips. Oliver slumped back against the nylon wall of the tent, utterly exhausted, his hands bleeding and bruised. They had beaten the freeze. But as Oliver closed his eyes, allowing himself a momentary sigh of relief, another massive structural groan echoed from the barn roof high above their shelter. This time it was followed by a sickening sound of rending wood, much closer than before. The blizzard was just getting started, and the century-old barn surrounding them was screaming under the weight of a storm it was never built to survive. The digital clock on Oliver's phone read 2014 a.m. The battery was sitting at 14%. Inside the nylon tent, The temperature hovered at a life-saving 58 degrees Fahrenheit, but the psychological atmosphere was suffocating. Every few minutes, the century-old barn surrounding their steel and hay bunker screamed in agony. Outside the micro-environment, the storm had escalated. According to the last scrambled radio broadcast they had caught before the local station's transmitter failed, meteorologist David Toller had classified the system as a historic anomaly. The barometric pressure had dropped so rapidly it was generating hurricane-force winds inland, driving dense wet snow that stuck to everything it touched, like frozen cement. Oliver lay awake, his arm wrapped defensively around Noah. Beside them, Rebecca stared blankly at the nylon ceiling, her hand rhythmically stroking Mia's hair. "How much weight can those metal arches hold?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might bring the roof down. "A lot," Oliver replied, grounding his voice in calm certainty to mask his own rising panic. "Corrugated steel is engineered to distribute vertical loads down the curve to the base. They use these Quonset designs in the Arctic. They can take thousands of pounds of snow. But can they take a falling barn?" Before Oliver could answer, a concussive boom shook the dirt floor beneath them. It wasn't the sound of wind. It was the distinct, terrifying sound of heavy structural timber shearing under immense pressure. Crack boom. The entire barn shuddered. Dust, ancient chaff, and frozen debris showered down, raining heavily onto the top of their bunker. The heavy steel arches above them groaned a low metallic screech of sheer physical stress, but they held. "Stay down," Oliver commanded, throwing his body over his children as Rebecca curled tightly against them. For 30 agonizing seconds, the air was filled with the sound of snapping wood and tearing shingles. A massive section of the barn's eastern roof had completely caved in. Hundreds of pounds of lumber, roofing tin, and wet snow slammed into the thick barrier of hay bales, insulating their Quonset tunnel. Inside the tent, the nylon walls pressed inward slightly from the shock wave, and the small catalytic heater flickered violently before stabilizing. Then an eerie, suffocating silence settled over the immediate area, isolating them from the howling wind outside. "Is everyone okay?" Oliver gasped, pulling himself up. "We're okay," Rebecca sobbed, clutching the kids. "Oliver, we're buried." "I can't hear the wind anymore." Oliver unzipped the tent flap and crawled into the small gap between the tent and the steel arch. He shined his fading maglite toward the staggered entrance he had built. It was completely blocked. The collapse had pushed the hay bales inward and dumped a mountain of debris directly over their exit. They were entombed. A new, far more immediate threat spiked in Oliver's chest. Oxygen. The catalytic heater was designed to be safe for indoor use, but only with proper ventilation. In a sealed, airtight space, it would slowly consume the remaining oxygen and replace it with carbon monoxide, an invisible, odorless killer. Oliver immediately turned the heater off. "Why did you do that?" Rebecca asked, her teeth instantly beginning to chatter as the chill from the steel walls began to creep back in. "The roof collapse sealed us in," Oliver stated bluntly, relying on cold facts to keep panic at bay. "If I leave the heater running, we suffocate. I have to dig an air shaft." He grabbed his heavy boots and his crowbar. He crawled to the front of the tunnel and began tearing at the compacted hay. It was grueling, claustrophobic work. The hay bales were pinned down by splintered rafters and heavy iron roofing panels. Every time he pulled a clump of hay-free, loose snow and dirt poured into the tunnel. "Think logically. Don't panic. Fix the problem," he repeated in his mind, an engineer's mantra. He needed a rigid pipe to push through the debris field. He remembered seeing a stack of leftover 4-inch PVC plumbing pipes in the corner of the stalls when they were grabbing the bolts. He had to reach them. Sweating profusely despite the freezing temperatures, Oliver used the crowbar as a lever, violently prying a shattered 2x6 board out of the way. He managed to create a gap just wide enough to squeeze his torso through. He wriggled out of the protective steel arch and into the main cavity of the barn. The devastation was absolute. Half of the massive timber roof was gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of whiteout snow. The temperature outside the bunker was instantly brutal, the wind violently ripping the remaining warmth from his sweat-soaked clothes. He scrambled over the wreckage, his flashlight beam slicing through the blizzard until it caught the white glint of the PVC pipe. He grabbed a 6-foot section and fought his way back to the bunker. Shoving the pipe through the dense wall of hay and collapsed snow, he angled it upward until he felt it punch through to the open air inside the ruined barn. A blast of freezing, fresh air rushed down the pipe. "Ventilation," Oliver choked out, exhausted, sliding back into the tunnel and collapsing next to the tent. He relit the heater. The blue flame roared back to life, safely drawing fresh oxygen from the makeshift intake valve. "You did it," Rebecca whispered, pulling him back into the tent and wrapping the heavy down comforter over his shivering shoulders. They spent the next 4 hours in a terrifying stalemate with nature. At 4:30 a.m., a small propane canister ran dry. The blue flame sputtered and died. "No," Oliver muttered. He didn't have any spare canisters. They were all sitting on a shelf in the farmhouse basement, a million miles away. Without the heater, the temperature inside the bunker began to drop steadily. 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 42 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Oliver knew the physics of their situation were shifting from comfort to pure survival. He initiated a strict protocol, huddle for core heat. They stripped off their bulky outer jackets, which were actually keeping their body heat trapped away from each other, and huddled in a tight cluster in the center of the sleeping pad, pulling the heavy jackets and wool blankets over the top of them. Keep awake. Hypothermia mimics exhaustion. If they fell asleep as the temperature dropped, they might not wake up. "Tell me a story, Noah," Oliver urged, rubbing his son's arms vigorously to generate friction. "Tell me about the treehouse we're going to build this summer." Noah, his voice weak but steady, began detailing a grand multi-level fortress in the Oaks. Rebecca chimed in, suggesting a rope bridge. They talked for hours, their breath forming thick white clouds in the freezing dark, relying entirely on the residual heat trapped within the hay walls and their own collective willpower. By 8 a.m., the suffocating darkness inside the bunker shifted to a dull, bruised gray. The violent shaking of the remaining barn walls had ceased. The ominous freight train roar of the wind was gone, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. The temperature inside the tent had flatlined at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. They were shivering uncontrollably, their muscles aching from the sustained tension, but they were alive. "Is it over?" Mia asked, her small face buried in Rebecca's chest. "I think so," Oliver croaked, his throat raw. He unzipped the tent. His joints were stiff, his hands clumsy from the cold. He crawled toward the entrance, pushing against the hay and the PVC pipe. Using his legs, he kicked out the remaining bales that blocked their exit. Light blinded him, pure, brilliant, unfiltered sunlight reflecting off a world of solid white. Oliver climbed out of the rubble and stood up. The sight stole whatever breath he had left. The 80-acre property was unrecognizable. The old oak tree that had severed their gas line was completely buried under a monstrous 10-foot snowdrift. The farmhouse was encased in a thick shell of rime ice, the windows blown out on the north side, the interior likely destroyed by the elements. The barn was a miracle of ruined architecture. The entire eastern half had collapsed directly onto their bunker. Farnsworth's unbuilt steel Quonset panels, reinforced by the dense hay bales, had acted like an armored shell. The heavy timber beams were resting directly on the curb steel, suspended mere inches above where their heads had been. Rebecca emerged from the tunnel holding the children. She stared at the crushed lumber resting on the steel arches. It held, Oliver agreed, tears finally breaking through his stoic facade, freezing instantly on his cheeks. Suddenly, a sound broke the pristine silence. It was a low, rhythmic, mechanical growl. Coming over the crest of the county road, a massive, bright orange Tucker snowcat was plowing through the 6-foot drifts. Its treads crushed the ice with aggressive authority. Attached to the front was a heavy hydraulic blade, tossing snow in massive arcs. Oliver waved his arms frantically. The machine roared into the yard and idled down. The heavy cab door swung open, and Carter Evans leaped out into the deep snow. Behind him emerged a man in a high-visibility jacket, paramedic, Jason Miller, from the county fire rescue. Carter waded through the waist-deep snow, his eyes wide as he took in the destroyed farmhouse, the collapsed barn, And finally, the family of 4 standing amidst the wreckage. "Oliver!" Carter shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. When the grid went down and the roads vanished, we thought, God, looking at the house, I thought you were gone. 2. We almost were, Oliver said, his voice ragged. He pointed to the crushed pile of lumber and hay in the center of the ruined barn, the silver edge of the Quonset panel barely visible beneath the wreckage. "We built a bunker." Jason Miller trudged up, immediately dropping his medical bag into the snow and pulling out heavy thermal shock blankets, wrapping them tightly around Noah and Mia. "You folks are freezing. We need to get you into the heated cab of the cat right now." As Jason and Rebecca guided the kids toward the idling machine, Carter stepped up beside Oliver. He looked at the collapsed barn, then down at the makeshift tunnel, noting the overlapping steel arches and the precise stacking of the hay. "Greg Farnsworth's old garage kit," Carter murmured in disbelief. "He left the bolts," Oliver said, a tired smile finally breaking across his face. "And we just put the pieces together." "You did more than that, neighbor," Carter said, clamping a heavy, warm hand onto Oliver's shoulder. "You outsmarted the mountain." Oliver took one last look at the ruined barn. The property was devastated. They would have to rebuild the farmhouse from the foundation up. The propane system was destroyed. The barn was a total loss. But as he looked toward the snowcat and saw Rebecca holding Noah and Mia in the warm glow of the cab, he knew the truth. They had lost the house, but they hadn't lost a single thing that mattered. If Oliver's incredible true story of survival, ingenuity, and a father's relentless will to protect his family during a deadly bomb cyclone kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who loves a gripping real-life survival story, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling tales of human resilience against the extreme forces of nature.